Well, welcome back to the Active Listener. My name is Mark Julian and I'm here to listen, not just hear. So we've got a really interesting guest today and we will be talking about hybrid working. So if you enjoy this conversation, please do consider subscribing by clicking that button somewhere here below. So Garima, welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you again. And I've thought, well, perhaps before we go on, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do and so on?
Happily. So I'm currently I'm the Chief Executive for Leadership Trust Singapore. That's Leadership Trust's foray into Asia over the last 2 years. I have, by qualification, I'm an organizational psychologist. So I've studied organizational behavior and gone on to do a lot of things around leadership development, learning, and sort of organizational change in large MNCs. I also had a small stint with a workplace strategy consulting firm for about a year before I started working with Leadership Trust here in Singapore. So very keen to sort of see how hybrid working and leadership come together in this conversation with you.
Excellent. And I must say again, I've plugged it several times before, Leadership Trust is an amazing organisation. I've really benefited from working with them. And I'm not on commission, so that's a genuine thing. So anyone who's listening, definitely check out the Leadership Trust. They are extremely good and very impactful. So hybrid working, it's kind of a buzz phrase at the moment, really blown up sort of post-lockdown and COVID. Prior to that, I know many companies were exploring it, but it seems to have really taken off because of that enforced lockdown. So I'd be interested to know from a leadership perspective and the work that you do, what is your take on hybrid working? What is your understanding of how it works?
Absolutely. I think sort of if we look at the context of the world in which we're working, which is becoming more and more sort of connected, even more so in the last 2 years, thanks to remote working, which is now becoming more hybrid, is that I think the West has been ahead of the curve, as has it been with modern management and leadership techniques in that sense. So the idea of hot desking or the idea of flexibility hasn't been new. It didn't hit a lot of organizations as something that they had to adapt to when the pandemic came. While in parts of Asia, parts of East, and perhaps organizations that have been driven by a more hierarchical structure, I think that was a bigger change, and that has led to sort of a bigger leap for them in how they adjust, how they quickly make sure mechanisms don't break down in the last 2 years or so. So clearly there's a lot of, and I think that's the same pattern one sees, interestingly, when it comes to modern management or business consulting and sort of leadership lessons. While there's a lot in mythology of a lot of countries, it hasn't necessarily translated into real leadership lessons today. And you see that typically in certain cultural origins as well. So that, I think, being the context, it has therefore been easier in some parts of the world for them to make it their own and really be acclimatized to what it meant to be virtual or what it meant to not be in office all the time. I wouldn't say ease with virtual. I think that everybody's learned to be able to pay attention to those 10%, 50% people who are joining virtually, even if sort of, the proximity bias has always been something that we're still working with. But especially in the East, I think it's becoming more normal now. And that, I think, sort of sets the context for where we are today, finding the balance between all or none with hybrid.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole load of things I think we could go in there, and I think particularly finding the balance is something that I've observed, and particularly as people have got used to working remotely, they don't always see the point of coming into the office, and the clue is in the name hybrid, where it is that combination of the two. And I think it's how do you strike that balance between being able to work remotely in the luxuries and the benefits that brings, but also seeing the benefits of being in the office, particularly if you live quite away from the office, and it's going to cost you in terms of time and money, and that time that you were traveling, you've recently been using to work. So I think that's a whole area that might be worth exploring too.
You know, I was listening to something by Oliver Burkeman. He does a lot of work on time management, and I think he did something on time management for models. And there was a very interesting line there, something about arguably all of your life is time management, because a lot of times it's thought of as sort of, how do I increase productivity? How do I make sure I utilize one evening? I cook all my dinners on the Sunday for the rest of the week to save time. And he takes it really far beyond. And the thing that really struck, and it sort of stayed with me, was the idea of looking at life as an average of 4,000 weeks that each of us has. And while I don't think that there's a lot of awareness about it, it is not how I practically think about everyday life. What happened with the pandemic is I realized that prioritizing what I do, the way I live life, what I get out of it, and all the other elements that should be equally important, have subconsciously somewhere gone in, and perhaps somewhere even consciously, to realize that there's only so much, there's finity to the time that I have, and how do I really want to spend it. And I think that really drives the idea of not wanting to do things that you believe are not adding value to yourself and hopefully to the broader team and organization, especially in the context of workplace. So I think that really is the underlying context of an individual's choice about what they're wanting to do. Because of course, there will be a lot of elements around, oh, are you really doing what you're supposed to do, and how performance is, and how teams are doing, and what the organization culture is. And we can get into that through this conversation. But I think the driver for wanting more, and the driver to get back a little bit of that time that you had been sort of so generously giving only to one aspect of your life 5 days a week, somewhere has that element of realizing that there's so much more.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. I think we've seen that played out with the whole thing about the big resignation, and I must say I'm mindful as well that a lot of people don't have the luxury to be able to work from home. It's just not an option within their jobs, so hybrid really wouldn't work for them. But yeah, there's definitely something about taking time back, and it's been a period where people are reflecting on what am I actually doing, and sometimes more about there's more to life than money, and striking that work-life balance. We have a finite number of days, weeks, years in our life, and how do we spend that time? So I think that's a really, really good point. What I would just add, actually, one thing that's really struck me, and I work in an international space, so I coach internationally, and certainly using Zoom and online has made things a whole lot easier. You know, I can be talking to someone in China in the morning, then in the afternoon in the States, and then Brazil in the evening or something. So that's really, really good. But one thing that struck me, having feedback from colleagues, is that they found remote working a real leveler, in the sense of it not being that division between those who are in the boardroom and those who are out. So there used to be, as you said, talking about maybe 10%, maybe 15% who are logging in from other parts of the world. That's gone. You know, you're all online. There's a lot more about being equal. Now, in terms of dynamic, it's not quite the same as being in the room with someone, which is why people will fly over for a meeting, because there's that whole thing of communication and linking. But I think it's interesting how it has also been a lever to some extent.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think there are studies, but like you said, Mark, I think there is no one size fits all. So it would vary so much from an individual to the industry, to the culture, to the geography, and sort of your circumstance for that particular month, for that particular year, for that matter, more than what works for you as a, you know, this is the kind of professional work arrangement that I want for life. But there are studies that show sort of the impact on introverts in their ability to now participate, or to be able to not have to do what they find difficult to do 5 days. Not just focus on work, but the entire social aspect of it, being out there, but to be able to recharge, do really well, thrive in the environment that they do, come back and give it all in that, say, 30%, 40% of the time that they would want to, or the anchor days, as I think some organizations are calling it, where you're wanting people to be, everybody to be in versus working remotely. So there is no denial that this has opened up sort of avenues for work for the average worker, as well as workplaces, to be able to be more inclusive in that sense. And we haven't really thought of inclusivity necessarily from that perspective of personality types, or what works best for me, how do you get the best out of me in terms of the working situation. And I think this really opens up that way of thinking for the culture within the organization. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I certainly agree about the one size fits all. It's interesting. I was talking to someone recently regarding introverted versus extroverted leadership, and they very much find it easier sort of the one-to-one. But part of the thing about being on a Teams call, for example, and there are other ways to talk other than Teams, by the way, not just plugging Teams, but is that often people wouldn't put the camera on, and they didn't feel able to tell them to, or if there's a lot of people on the screen, it was harder to connect, and they found it much easier, particularly as an introvert, to sort of have one-on-one meetings with people rather than big group settings. So I think it absolutely varies, and it's almost like a tool within a box in terms of how we work. But sort of picking up from what you were saying earlier about hierarchy and structure and so on, one thing, again, I noticed working in an organisation where a lot of people were sceptical about hybrid working. It was being brought in, but prior to the lockdown, not everyone was able to take that up, or people implemented it in different ways. And there was definitely a feeling of, look, we can't work remotely. We won't deliver the figures. We won't be able to get stuff done. We need to all be in the office. Enforced lockdown came, certainly in the UK. And it was remarkable how, certainly within groups who were very agile, they made it work. And that went across the organisation. Suddenly it's like, oh, this does work. We can get the job done. In fact, we've exceeded our targets. We've gone over and above. So there is something in this. So I'd be interested to hear what your experience is, what you've observed in terms of sort of structure and how leaders have been able to adapt to that. And indeed, as we've come out of the lockdown, returning, and what does that look like now?
Absolutely. And I think, like I was saying at the beginning, I think there's an uncanny similarity in the arc that you see or a spectrum of where the leadership style or organizational style lies, sort of very authoritarian top down to a very laissez-faire situation that's possible. And a lot of organizations are moving towards structures where there is no reporting at all. When you think about the way workplace strategies or new workplaces sort of have evolved, where there has been 100%, everybody has a desk, you're in it, you do it all the time, that's the only way to work, to sort of a free for all, decide what works for you, we'll see you when we'll see you. If you ask me, there is definitely a happy middle, both in terms of leadership style. That there is a certain amount of guidance and as we call it at Leadership Trust, a winning of hearts and minds. So people need to understand why they're doing it, and they need to feel engaged passionately towards the purpose. So you're able to take them along, and you do that by being somewhere in the middle, not really sitting there and telling them what to do and think for everybody. And the same way with the workplace, I feel sort of it can't be one or the other, and that averages out by style of employees and what you do. But there is a happy middle where you're basically talking about what % of time does it work for whom? Because if you look at the larger structure around workplace, like we were saying, there's an individual who's driven by what individuals are driven by. And it starts with sort of being able to feel the satisfaction and happiness and your ability to contribute and be part of something, to the way teams work and to the way the organization works. So what's the individual achieving? What does the team need to achieve? And what does the organization need to do? And when you bring all of that in, I think that's where hybrid is where we're settling more and more, and which leads to that change in leadership as well, which always was needed, because the project, the situation, team members could have always changed. You never knew how much stability you had or what kind of ambiguity you could have dealt with. If you knew how to be agile, if you knew what are the classics of being a good leader or a manager or being in a team, you were doing that well, irrespective of what was thrown at you. And pandemic was one such big thing, arguably, but not to say that businesses aren't hit by much worse. And therefore, the pendulum does sort of come and rest somewhere in both in the style of leadership management as well as in the style of workplace that comes together with hybrid, if that answers your question in some way.
Yeah, I think what I'm picking up there from what you're saying as well, it's almost like for some people or some organizations, the lockdowns, the COVID and the move to working from home forced their hand in terms of having to be agile. And those that are already displaying or working in agile organizations, it would be a natural thing anyway, and they were probably using hybrid in some way, shape or form, and they had the abilities to, well, they probably would have gone there anyway. But for others, it has forced people to have to respond, to have to do so in an agile way because they haven't got any other option. Would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. And realizing that you need those just to be prepared, just to do well. And pandemic just sort of forced their hand. Absolutely. And which is not to say that everybody is still doing it. Of course, we know that there are big issues around losing control or not feeling like you're able to drive performance, not feeling confident in your ability to lead a team, for example, from a leader's perspective. If I'm not able to see you, if you're not there, I'm still figuring what the tools are and what my own personal capabilities need to be able to lead and to be part of organizations now with less apparent control over situations.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something about control there, both from the perspective of an employee who's being managed, that there are many people that I've spoken to that really, really struggled having to work from home. They much prefer the conversations face to face, and also just being in an environment. There are others that, particularly if they're on their own or they just don't get energized being alone, it's really, really important. I think the other struggle has been the practicalities of managing, and I've certainly seen kind of people knocking against one another. Now there's been much more move to hybrid rather than working remotely. People kind of get used to working a certain way, and then it's like, oh, we had change, now there's another change, and they feel that control is being taken. Well, I have to go into the office, it's not fair. So and then managers that may be struggling because they want to go back to that way of working. I'd be interested to know from a sort of psychological perspective, what are your thoughts regarding leadership and hybrid working?
I think there's been definitely a lot of challenge in to leadership or in people's perception of what leadership was through pandemic, because I think very good leaders, people who had done really well, not just from a business performance, but from the way their team saw them, their ability to sort of lead people, take them along, who have found themselves wondering if it's okay that people don't come back to office 5 days a week. So I don't think it necessarily stemmed from one's lack of leadership, the perception of how workplace needs to be, but sort of the lack of self-awareness or the lack of awareness around what truly is making performance in a team or an individual, and what drives people to do their best, I think, was taken for granted. You had a certain style, you developed it, and you practiced it if you were a good leader. And if you weren't, then you were heavily leaning on sort of a little bit more of a control authority situation where a little bit more stick than carrot, and that happens everywhere. But even for the good leader, even for people who were practicing, who were sort of investing in themselves to understand that it isn't just about telling people what to do, it's about taking people along. It's about investing in my my employees so that if they stay, I make the most of it. You know, it's not a matter of if I invest in my people and they leave. It's the matter of if you don't invest in them and they stay. And people have lived that philosophy truly. And yet, I think pandemic and sort of remote working, not seeing people, questioning whether people are putting everything in their jobs was a natural sort of a hump to overcome for most people. And I think the good ones have honestly picked up very quickly with the kind of projects, work, program change that they've tried to bring around in their organization and their teams, digital and tech savviness that they've ensured they go through and their teams go through, the kind of support you have ensured that people have in different workplaces, which is outside of the workspace, understanding elements of cost saving and business savviness that comes with reducing your infrastructural footprint of an office and things like that. So people have made the most of it because those were the right decisions from a long-term return ROI on what they believe their leadership could do for their organizations versus doing it because you didn't have a choice. And then, of course, there are ones that are still struggling because it is a big challenge on your ability to lead. You've never met some of the people who are coming in. You've got Generation Z who's coming in, who responds really well, perhaps, to being able to work remotely in their ability to take more initiative. But are you really able to get them onboarded well? Are you really able to spend the kind of time you want early in the years of a professional coming into the organization? Create the culture that you believe goes long way in the well-being of the employee part of that organization. So I think the challenge of building yourself as a leader has definitely been exaggerated. And if you don't see that, so it very quickly, I think, would sort through people. It accentuates the tests on leadership if it hadn't before.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, it's interesting the point you made about Gen Z and millennials coming in and the impact that having to work remotely could have on their career, because I think there's a lot that we take for granted, having some of us being older than others, having been around for a while. You've got connections, you know who to talk to, you know to navigate spaces. If you suddenly now work remotely, you have to be much more proactive in the sense of you can't bump into people or have a coffee. You have to make those appointments, and that can feel a little bit more staid, a little bit staged. So I think that's an interesting point. I would also say what's coming through there, it's very much about seeing people as people, not resources. It's really about investing in your people. And again, not one size fits all. It's what's good for the individual, what's good for the team. You look after your people, you look after the team, and then the company itself benefits. But again, that can be challenging if you're very much used to a certain way of thinking and a leadership style. So what do you do as an organisation, and particularly you as an individual, regarding helping people adapt perhaps to a more agile way of working in light of hybrid and just the way things are moving on in the business world?
Absolutely. And you're right in sort of, if the organization and the leaders within it or the teams within it aren't able to take the view of both the individual, not just sort of the individual, but the teams and the larger organization, then you aren't perhaps looking at the entire the the playground's much bigger than being able to say, what do I need to provide to make sure that there's comfortable hybrid working, for example. Workspaces is an element of it. How teams are working and how much sort of a digital capability and tech savviness you're bringing in is an element of it. What is the larger idea of well-being? What is the larger idea of happiness and engagement is another piece of it. And it all sorts of comes together in looking at each individual on their own, the relationships that they're able to build, how well are they able to communicate, be they 6 months old in the organization or sort of 16 years into it, how well are the teams collaborating, and therefore sort of what's performance looking like, all of that in addition to solid processes, so that people have clarity on what they need to do and sort of be able to bring how they want to do it to the table. There is, for us, I think at Leadership Trust, it's of course the entire existence of our operation in Asia is being made possible because we were open to hybrid, we were open to remote, we were able to early on build the trust that you need to do to be able to say that teams may not even meet for the first year plus of the existence of a very global organization, because one did not know when they could travel, one did not know when borders would open again, which is not to say that it did not come with its own challenges and it was not sort of a painless process, but it is a testament to understanding what is needed, the hygiene factors, the minimums that we need to have. So we know that we're building something as we keep working through the different aspects of sort of forming, storming, norming and performing, a model that we use a lot at the Leadership Trust when it comes to a team's performance. And then there has been the entire outlook towards clients who themselves have struggled. Some identified it early on in the journey that if I can't get my people to meet for another 6 months, another 8 months, what is that doing to my organization, to my leaders, to my teams, and how can you come and help us do that? To organizations who are now coming to realize that they need support around it. So to be able to create solutions and work both not just internally with our teams, but with clients to ensure that even if it's remote, there is a good dose of leadership and learning and what we do experientially to help you overcome the challenges of not being able to have a quick chat at the over coffee or go out for a beer and make sure that you sort of ironed out those issues, which can very easily happen, go unsaid, not be able to see somebody's body language change in a conversation, but they didn't say anything, and you lose all of those cues, and that keeps building itself. So how do you sort of ensure there's an assessment of team's health and the team understands where they are and where they want to get to, and sort of goes beyond BS commitments in actually putting their personal investment towards the organization. So it's been very interesting, quite honestly.
Excellent. And so where do you see things going sort of post-COVID introduction or the growth of hybrid working? What does it look like to you? What does the landscape in the business world and broader seem to you to be?
In my sort of little, if I was to do a little bit of that future telling, and I think I very strongly believe that it comes to its natural equilibrium in terms of the balance that it will have to strike, and therefore hybrid is here to stay. I don't think I'm a big advocate of 100% online workplace, if you ask me, because I think certain elements are lost in the long term in that setup. Now, that may suit individuals or teams for the time being, for a certain project, the way they work, and that needs to be part of how we're inclusive towards different work styles. But when you average it out across the organization and industry, I think it'll come to a very happy middle on being able to find that sort of at least 30%, if not a little more, depending on organization, where people come together and sort of that interpersonal, in-person equation and culture building is not lost in the long term. And I think that goes a long way towards how brands are created and how you feel proud about working for an organization. It goes a little beyond the comfort that you have in working for them, while that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I would agree. There's something there. I mean, certainly I know organisations where they're working at 40 to 60% coming into the office or working from home. Others, it may not be that that's the case, that it's not enforced, but at very least there's an anchor day, maybe once a month or something, or so. I mean, even then it may not be that frequent, but you still come together maybe for a week or something. So there's still that interaction. And I would say most people would say the same thing. They may not see the benefit of necessarily having to come in a set number of days per week, but they do see the benefit of an anchor day, of coming together, because there's something there about, as you said, building culture, building identity, and a sense of belonging, really. And it's those kind of water cooler coffee conversations that, you know, oh yeah, I know someone who can help with that project that perhaps you'd miss out on just being purely remote. But again, there are challenges to both sides of that coin.
And I think if I don't see as an employee why it's important, or I haven't been, it hasn't been demonstrated in some way, then it becomes a difficult case to convince me to just do it for the sake, because it is good, because that's gone out of the equation, saying just because I'm telling you, believe me that this is the right way to do it. It has to be more than that. It has to go beyond that. And that therefore the onus comes onto the organization and the leadership in how well they engage and how well they have the not just the heads but the hearts of people in wanting them to want more than sort of, this is something I do on the side in my life. If I do this 8 hours a day, then there's a lot more that I want out of it. And how do I get that? I think is the pitch to be made.
Yeah, there's something there about trust. There's something there about investment. Otherwise, if it's a box ticking exercise, well, I'm going in because I've been told to go in, you're probably going to see more people leaving simply because they don't want to be told what to do. They feel it's being forced upon them, and they don't necessarily see the benefits. So I think seeing the benefits is really important.
And that's where good leadership comes in, honestly. It doesn't have to be just about work, you know, it's about asking the right questions that help you think about what is it that you're wanting to get out of it, and hopefully being able to offer that as an organization is the entire picture. So yeah, absolutely not about, I'm telling you that it's good for you, so you must be in office at least 2 days a week. I don't think that pitch works. And that's, again, the easy way out of sort of using a little bit of your authority to get things done than people really wanting it.
Very interesting conversation, Garima. I appreciate your time, and I think there's a lot of issues here we could explore further. So I understand you will be coming back onto the podcast at some point, but thank you for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Super. Thanks so much, Mark. See you soon again.
Take care.